Liz mentioned my name is Dana Marie Thomas. Please call me DM. I am a researcher in the Strategic Energy Security Group headed by Elijah Hotchkiss. And we are very excited to launch this summer webinar series today. Like Liz mentioned, the series was coordinated in partnership with JISEA and the Strategic Energy Security Group within the ESR, and it has been taking place over the past month. You can see on the slide, we kicked off with Dr. Troy Nash and Ariel Nash around affordable housing solutions, and then we went in with Dr. Sampson discussing demographic projections and energy planning. And we wanted to give NREL researchers an opportunity to hear from new voices as we work on understanding these migration-based impacts on energy systems. So we are very honored to host these experts and thought leaders, and we hope these webinars provide novel insights and serve as a launching point for new projects. Today, our presenter is, next slide please, is Dr. Clive Katiba Tsuma, and Dr. Tsuma will be presenting on climate adaptation and migration, legal frameworks, and international response. This webinar is going to explore the evolving international legal frameworks designed to address the needs of populations displaced by climate change. And he's going to pay special attention to Kenya, Rwanda, the Asian region, and other countries, exploring how these countries are addressing the legal challenges faced by displaced populations. In terms of Dr. Tsuma's background, he holds a PhD in public policy and urban affairs from the Nelson Mandela School of Public Policy at Southern University, A&M, and a Master of Arts in International Relations from United States International University, Africa. Dr. Tsuma's areas of specialization include public policy, international relations, maritime affairs, and information communication technology. He's worked in various academic research institutions, including Cal State University Maritime Academy, and his research agenda focuses on the social impacts of technology and the effects of politics, education, the environment, and public policy. So now we are going to shift over to Dr. Tsuma's presentation. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Dr. Dana. I hope everybody can hear me. I appreciate your introduction. I will not go into the details about that, but first of all, before I continue with my presentation, I just want to tell you how much excited I am, and I appreciate your invitation to make me part of this important conversation. As you have heard from Dr. Dana, I am looking at the climate adaptation and migration, specifically trying to look at some of the legal framework and international responses to this critical and emerging issue. So just for an introduction, on the first slide, we are looking at what exactly is climate adaptation and how does it play into people moving from one place to the other. So climate adaptation is simply that process where people are trying to adjust to the impacts of climate change. And as we have seen all over, lives are being changed. People are moving from one place to another because of the climate change effects, or rather crises. So the migration part of it is simply that movement of people due to these impacts. And there are several factors that tend to influence some of this human mobility. There could be political factors in terms of political conflict or violence. It could be social impacts in terms of race or economic, for that matter, even environment and cultural aspects. So we see the link between climate adaptation and migration playing out every day in our lives. So today's conversation, it's very, very important for us to try and understand the complexity or the relationship between the aspect of adaptation and migration in this case. And to be able to understand that linkage helps us as researchers and even policymakers to be able to come up with specific responses in this case. It talks to the international cooperation that is required to be able to address some of these important issues that are coming up. We also be able to draw up a new legal framework by examining what we have right now and questioning whether that kind of framework actually fits into the aspect of climate crisis that we are facing today. Also, we can be able to come up with an increased support to provide the necessary either humanitarian or any other interventions to this affected community. And also looking at the legal framework, we are able to try and recognize what are the rights of these people. Do they have any rights? And if at all, are we following it up and are we giving them the right protection that are required? So you'll realize that in trying to mitigate all this, we try to reduce the vulnerability and even enhance resilience in this kind of communities. So that is just a brief introduction, and looking forward, we are going to try and move further into some of the objectives of our discussions today. For example, we will look at the challenges surrounding climate adaptation and migrations. What are they? What prompts these kind of issues to start moving ahead? We will also look at the international legal framework on climate refugees and try to dissect whether these international legal framework actually speak to the problem of climate refugees or not. And if that is the case, what kind of proposals can we have in terms of coming up with better legal frameworks that can be able to accommodate this emerging crisis? We will also look at some of the limitations, the existing limitations in international law, especially on climate refugees. This conversation will also give us an opportunity to look at what are some of the pathways to legal reform after looking at what we have right now in terms of policy. Do we have opportunities where we can work on specific reforms to address some of these problems? And then we will also look at the insights to climate adaptation. Climate adaptation and resilience is a very important aspect, and we will look at specific areas as Dr. Thomas talked earlier on, and how these communities are trying to adapt through energy and such like kind of interventions. And then, of course, we'll be able to look at the renewable energy system projections within this climate population. So, looking at some of the complexities and the challenges of climate adaptation, there are very different climate conditions that lead to people moving from one place to the other. We got stories or issues of rising sea levels as an example of a condition that leads to mobility. We have situations where communities face droughts and persistent heat, and even floods and storms. These are some of the conditions that bring forth the challenges that climate adaptation actually faces in this case. And what are some of these adaptations? We look at the disruptions in terms of social lives, disruptions in terms of cultures. We see people being uprooted from their original home to move either across borders or displaced within the same international boundaries, or simply a temporary kind of migration. So you will see how this complexity turned into the kind of challenges that we face. And then finally, how can we be able to mitigate some of these challenges through legal protections and recognitions? How can we be able to support adaptation and resilience within this area? And we will also look at some of the frameworks that we can be able to employ to be able to take care of some of these areas. So looking at this chart actually gives you a preview of exactly the possible mobilities and responses to the different climatic hazards. It could be because of the rising sea levels that causes people to move from one place to the other. It could be because of droughts, persistent droughts, floods, and even heat waves that make people move from one place to the other. And what we have to understand is the difference. We have people who move across borders. We have people who have been displaced within their own countries. We are also having people who temporarily move from one place to the other. And these situations are all over the world. And we will be able to look at them and be able to discuss how we can be able to mitigate some of these issues. And to be able to understand better the mitigation efforts in this regard, it's always good also to look at what are some of the trends as far as refugees are concerned. And this slide looks at some of the regional refugee trends and how the issue of climate migration is actually a big existential crisis facing us today. So if you can take a look at that, that slide and the projections that we have between 2010 and 2023, we have had an amazing shift as far as the numbers of refugees in host countries are concerned. When you take a look at, for example, from 2010, and you look at how much Africa was hosting in terms of its refugees, we have almost double digits in 2021. So Africa was at 2.5 million, for example, refugees in 2010. But when you take a look at 2023, we have about 2.3 million refugees. The same applies to America, which was like less than a million, but right now we're talking about 1.8 million. Asia is actually the biggest victim in this case, where in 2010, we only had about 5.7 million, and now we are looking at 12.9. Europe is one of them as well. So we see the trends actually increasing as we move ahead. And when we talk about what exactly is the most existential threat to humanity nowadays, we should be looking at it from a climate point of view, other than political in this case. So that graph actually shows you how Africa, America, Asia, and Europe are actually performing in this regard. And we can see that Asia is actually at the top of the refugee trends in this case. Besides the trends in refugees, we also now move closer to our discussion today in terms of the climate-related displacements. And according to the International Migration Organization, it is estimated that by 2050, we will have about 216 million people displaced as a result of climate change. So these are projections that we can see that has increased cross-border climate migrations due to intensity in climate change. And this accounts to, in Asia, for example, floods, storms, fire, drought, extreme temperatures tend to disrupt some of these migrations and responsible to it. So we can see that as we move forward, the issue of climate change is actually taking a forefront as regards to the challenges that the world is facing today. Now, when you look at the next slide, is talking about the internal disaster displacement trends. Now, mostly when we look at refugee situations, we always talk about refugees moving from one country to the other. But the most critical displacement is actually happening within borders. So according to the United Nations High Commission for Refugees, IDPs are actually described as people who tend to move from their homes due to disasters, but have not crossed internationally recognized borders. And we have a lot of data to support this fact. In countries with the highest number of internally displaced people include China with about 4.7, Turkey with 4.1, the Philippines 2.6, Somalia in Africa 2.6, 2 million, and then Bangladesh to 1.8 million people. So we can see that the major problem that we are facing as far as climate migration and disasters and displacement is actually happening within borders. It's all over, even in the United States, for example, when we have issues of drought, issues of cyclones, issues of tornadoes, and everything actually tends to contribute to these internally displaced people. So we can see, according to the graph, how that has actually taken root. And Asia still takes the highest beating when it comes to internally displaced people. The next question that we are looking at today is to ask ourselves, what are the plights of these refugees, particularly those who seek asylum and they have to cross international borders, particularly at sea? So according to research, approximately 15% of refugees use the sea routes, while 85% tend to flee from a crisis area. Actually focuses on the sea area because it has been researched and understood that the sea route is the most dangerous issue affecting some of the refugees in this case, particularly the Mediterranean Sea. Over 20,000 deaths and disappearances have been reported since 2014. So you will find that people trying to flee from crisis, either climate or otherwise, face issues such as drowning, exploitation, complex asylum procedures, shipwrecks, piracy and robbery, and even arbitrary detentions. And those are some of the things that we look at when we're trying to address the issue of legal frameworks that face this kind of migration. So on the next slide, we are looking at what exactly is the legal consideration for the protection of climate refugees specifically. And for us to be able to understand the plight of climate refugees, we look at the international instruments and even regional instruments that have been forwarded, in this case, to take care of refugees as a whole. So when you're looking at the international instruments, we have, for example, the international. We also have the international maritime law and the international human rights law. So a close look at international refugee law, for example, can be found in the 1951 Convention relating to the status of refugees. And in Article 1, 2, tends to define exactly what a refugee is. And this convention, this law only defines refugees as people fleeing from political persecution, from race, religion, or social groups. There is nowhere within this framework where climate refugees have been mentioned or defined in this case. So you take a look at this law and you can see the limitations within the same confines. Another limitation is that when this convention was done, it was during the World War II and World War I. So it was actually a law that was meant to take care of people fleeing from the world wars to different nations, particularly in Europe. It was only in 1960-69 that it was ratified as an international law, and missing within that framework was actually the issue of climate refugees. There is also the issue of international maritime law. And within the international maritime law, we have three aspects that speak to the issue of refugees. One of it is the safety of life at sea, known as SOLAS Convention. And this is a convention that speaks to the communication, coordination of any rescue efforts at sea. So this was actually as a result of reaching out to stranded sailors at sea, and it does not also speak specifically to climate refugees in this case. And as we will also look at it, it also has its own limitations in terms of protecting the climate refugees as we have seen them emerge currently. Also, there is the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea. This is a convention that requires any vessel along the waterways to be able to render assistance to any person in danger at sea. We will also see how limited this convention is as far as the climate refugees are concerned. And then we also have the International Convention on Maritime Search and Rescue. This also calls on any vessel along the sea to be able to assist in any distress area, to be able to provide search and rescue and any humanitarian help to anybody who is stranded at sea. And as we have seen recently, there are cases of a lot of refugees, for example, stranded along the sea in the Mediterranean area. But there is also a conflict when it comes to how much can we be able to provide in this regard. And then, of course, finally, there is the international human rights law, which is pegged on the 1948 Universal Declaration of Human Rights. It gives every human being rights for justice, for freedom, but it speaks little as far as climate refugees are concerned. And then, of course, we have other regional refugees instruments that work in concert with the international law instruments. For example, the African Convention on Human Rights. All these tend to borrow from the international law on human rights. There is the African Convention on Refugees, European Convention on Human Rights, European Charter for Fundamental Rights, all these, including the American Convention on Human Rights or Asian Human Rights Declaration. They all are regional instruments that supplement what has actually been done on an international level. So those are some of the considerations when we're looking at climate refugees. And we ask ourselves, are these in order? Are they able to give us a specific framework that we can be able to go to in trying to address some of these problems or challenges? So we move to the next slide, and we look at what are some of the existing limitations as far as international law on climate refugees are concerned. We have seen how the international instruments work and regional instruments as well, but there are still limitations when it comes to climate refugees. And the question is, are climate refugees being denied their human rights as far as the Universal Declaration of Human Rights is concerned? Are they being denied their rights as far as search and rescue is concerned, as far as communication at sea is concerned? So some of these are actually, this slide projects some of the areas that have been neglected when it comes to climate refugees. One area is the definition part of it. As we have seen in the definition on international law on refugees, does not define what climate refugee is. And even according to some studies, it's also still up to now not able to come up with a specific definition. There are those ones who define climate refugees as climate refugees or environmentally displaced people. This kind of narrow definition beats the notion of identifying and specifically focusing any interventions towards a climate change. There is also the aspect of persecution requirements, right? So when we're talking about political persecution or racial persecution or any other persecution, there's nowhere within the existing international framework where climate refugees have been referred to as they are being persecuted in this regard, and therefore they do not feature anywhere in the current international law. There is also no protection for environmental refugees in this case. Most countries have legal framework in places where political violent refugees are actually addressed within the municipal law of that country. But the environmental refugees do not get the same. There's also the issue of protection. How much protection can these people be given in this case? Are there provisions for permanent protections? And you will find that most climate refugees do not get this kind of permanent provisions for protection in this case. And then there is also a question of mitigation of these, the causes of climate change and climate refugees. a lot of focus of the international framework focuses mostly on mitigation rather than on the plight of the refugees themselves. When you look at the guidelines in relation to international framework, there is no clear guideline for climate-related asylum seekers. So you can see how these limitations actually come in to provide a big challenge to any interventions on climate adaptation in this regard. Also, there is a limited scope for internal displacements. Internal displacements, which we saw earlier on, contributes to the largest movement of people, has been mostly relegated to the problem of an individual country. So if we are having people within a specific country in Sri Lanka experiencing floods, for example, and they are moving from one place to the other, it is not really the responsibility of the international response in this case, unless they are asked to. The sole responsibility is left on the country itself. And some of these countries might not be having the necessary interventions that are required to take care of that. There is also no consideration of climate vulnerability in this framework in this case. The only vulnerable people that are considered is those ones who are politically or racially or socially persecuted in this case. So we view the current legal framework, international or otherwise, to be outdated. And because the climate change issue is a current issue, this international framework cannot and does not address adequately the problem of climate change. That is also true with the international cooperation that comes with this kind of interventions, the enforcement policy that comes with these interventions, and even the support that is required for climate adaptation in this case. So this is just an example of some of the problems and limitations of the current international framework in this case. And a good example was, for example, where the international law clashes with municipal law, for example. In 2020, we had the Mass Second incident where a boat carrying migrants from Libya was crossing the Mediterranean, and it ran into a distress call. So MASEC was identified to go and rescue the migrants at sea. So you find that they went and rescued these people, but the problem was, where do we take them, right? They were denied entry in Italy, they were denied entry in Malta, and they stayed over 26 days at sea. So it became a humanitarian issue. So this is where an example where international law actually clashes with municipal law, because as much as the captain of this ship recognized the aspect of international law to go and rescue stranded people, international law at the same time could not allow him to disembark the migrants on Italy's soil or Malta soil because of what? The issue of territorial integrity. So you can see how international relations, international law, and international interventions actually interfere with the adaptation and even interventions and responses of climate refugee issues. So in this case, what are some of the legal framework and international responses to these climate refugees? We cannot actually claim that the international response has not been forthcoming. And this slide actually shows us some of the trends and timelines of global legal framework and approaches that have been instituted to address or accommodate the current climate crisis that we are facing today. So there are certain recommendations where for example, the expansion of the 1951 Refugee Convention has actually taken place. There are new developments that have been have been instituted to be able to take care of this. Some of them are regional, some of them are national. So when you take a look at this graph, for example, in 1951 all the way to 2018, we see specific efforts to be able to redefine the legal framework and accommodate the climate refugees or climate crisis in this case. So we have overreaching regimes, for example. We have now environmental climate regimes being identified, and also migration and refugee regimes being identified. So in this case, there is a lot of cooperation that has taken place in terms of international cooperation, in terms of protection and assistance, in terms of even data collection and analysis, and climate resilience adaptation. So this actually slide shows us that despite the limitations that we have seen facing the legal framework, there is also a lot of other interventions as far as policy is concerned to be able to address this. And how does renewable energy therefore play into all these in terms of refugee communities? So climate refugee crisis seems to offer a very rare opportunity for deployment of renewable energy, particularly to vulnerable populations. We have, for example, these opportunities in terms of energy access for refugees, renewable energy that tends to reduce displacement. We also have interventions, for example, resilience, particularly in host communities, and enhanced food security and public health, job creation. Those are some of the adaptations through renewable energy that we can look at to be able to build the resilience of climate refugees in this case. So in most cases, renewable energy deployment can actually be able to support community renewable energy initiatives, and we see that happening all over the world. There is also the aspect of implementation of decentralized renewable energy system, situations where energy can also be stored and supplement the national grids to be able to support energy to these kind of areas, and also climate infrastructure in this case. So you will see the climate adaptation through renewable energy is actually a very important aspect, and the crisis actually provides that opportunity where such kind of intervention can actually take place. So some of the insights to climate adaptation and resilience could actually be seen within specific regions in Africa, for example, and in Europe or Asia. This slide looks at sub-Saharan Africa and how sustainable electricity access in refugee settlements has actually taken up in terms of solar paneling, in terms of using of batteries to be able to accommodate the energy situation in these communities. So we can see, for example, Ethiopia being at the height of the number of connections in Ethiopia in the residential places is higher in this regard. So Kenya is one of them, and I picked Kenya because of its aspect in terms of refugees. Kenya holds quite a number of refugees from around the Great Lake region, Somalia, Sudan, and Ethiopia. So when you take a look at some of these countries, they are always facing strife, be it political, be it environmental, and most of the refugees end up in Kenya. So Kenya has the largest refugee centers in East Africa and Sub-Saharan region in Kakuma and Dadaab. So you'll find that Kenya has developed a legal framework to enable investment into renewable energy that has supplied energy to these communities in Kakuma and Dadaab in this regard. One of the major ones is actually the Lake Turkana wind project that produces about 130 megawatts into the national grid. So you can see how a specific country like Kenya is mitigating the issue of refugees and providing, investing into renewable energy as a means of resilience. Rwanda is also another example where there is a law that actually incorporates the aspect of refugees to be able to work within Rwanda itself. It's also working with the United Nations High Commission for Refugees to come up with renewable energy for refugees in Rwanda. There is also the national strategy and energy sector plan that is incorporated in the Rwandese agenda in this case. So we can see all these as interjections or interventions within the countries that hold and harbor and also have refugee populations among them. And then, of course, we have also pathways to renewable energy in Southeast Asia. And the reasons why we pick this is because of its intense high numbers of refugees in this area. So we have nearly 5.3 million disaster replacements that were recorded during the year 2021 in South Asia. This is according to the Internal Displacement Monitoring Center. So the climate drivers include monsoon winds, storms, cyclones, and droughts within this area. And South Asia states pursue more equitable development that advances climate resilience. We look at agriculture, we look at renewable energy projects, and even green housing projects in this area. And we look at how they are trying to mitigate some of these issues. So looking at the renewable share in total final energy consumption, you will see South Asia being a major player when it comes to renewable energy consumption, followed with Southeast Asia. And then, of course, lastly, we have North Asia in this case. So the share of renewable energy in individual countries, for example, in India, we have about 37%, Bangladesh 34%, Pakistan we have 46%, and Sri Lanka we have 51% of renewable energy consumption. So this provides a way where renewable energy is actually making a very important inroads into taking care of some of these climate displaced areas and people. So as we conclude, we have looked at some of these adoption areas, the areas of legal framework, and now transitioning to a more greener pathway. And as I conclude, maybe a question that I might pose to UNRWA is, how can the UNRWA researchers take more interdisciplinary approach to guide the energy system projections and interventions, especially among vulnerable populations like climate refugees in this case?